Dead stop. For 72 hours, the bombardment seemed unstoppable. Then, at 0430 local time on April 19, 2024, the last missile from an Israeli F-35 struck a radar site near Isfahan. The threat of relentless strikes, explicitly warned by U.S. officials just days earlier, dissolved into an eerie silence. The air campaign against Iran simply halted. No follow-up waves, no explanation. The operational pause was instant, total, and completely unexpected. What the public did not know, what the strike planners had just discovered, was a classified Iranian program. Buried beneath a limestone ridge near the city of Qom, satellite infrared scans had picked up a massive heat bloom. Analysts at CENTCOM initially dismissed it as industrial activity, but cross-referencing it with a Mossad human intelligence report from 8 months earlier revealed something terrifying. The Iranians had not merely hidden a few mobile launchers, they had excavated an entire subterranean network, over 60 reinforced bunkers, connected by tunnels, housing a new generation of radar-guided missiles. The system was designed to activate in staggered waves, ensuring no single suppression strike could silence it. Worse, the high-resolution imagery showed what looked like hundreds of decoy sites scattered across the desert. Inflatable launchers, fake radar domes, thermal emitters wired to mimic active batteries. The strike package, designed on expectations of degrading maybe 40% of Iran's air defenses, now faced a target set 3 times larger than assumed. The math collapsed. F-35s and cruise missiles were survivable against a known threat. Against an invisible, redundant grid of this scale, the risk of losing multiple aircraft and the political toll of a failed raid became unacceptable. The red line planners thought Iran would cross, nuclear breakout, was not what halted the jets. The red line was air defense overmatch, hidden in plain sight and discovered just hours before the deadline. That revelation about air defense overmatch was just one half of the grim calculus. A classified Pentagon briefing, circulated only to a handful of commanders, outlined the options. It was a munitions affordability study that read like a stop work order. Iran had dozens of nuclear-related facilities, many deep underground. The Pentagon's war planners began by mapping every aim point. They counted ventilation shafts, centrifuge halls, uranium storage vaults. The list ran to more than 500 discrete targets. For each hardened site, standard doctrine called for multiple precision-guided bunker busters, each delivered in rapid succession to carve a path to the buried chamber. The math was brutal. A single facility like Fordow, burrowed deep inside a mountain near Qom, might require multiple direct hits from the heaviest penetrators just to damage its entrance, and even then, the most sensitive areas could survive. The stockpile check came next. The U.S. inventory of the GBU-57 massive ordnance penetrator, the largest conventional bunker buster, stood at no more than 2 dozen, with many already allocated to contingency plans for North Korea. JDAM tail kits were plentiful, but the specialized blast fragmentation warheads needed for hard target defeat were not. Internal summaries projected a staggering deficit. To achieve a significant degradation of Iran's enrichment capability, the campaign would require a large number of precision munitions in the first week alone. Available stocks in theater, even after drawing down from Europe and the Pacific, barely reached 700. The shortfall was not marginal, it was crippling. Commanders saw the numbers and reached an unavoidable conclusion. The opening phase of the air war would consume the nation's most precious munitions, yet still fail to set Iran's clock back by more than a few months. The math did not lie. The arsenal was simply not built for a sustained campaign against a country 3 times the size of Iraq. Even if the bomb bays had been full, the strike planners faced a more fundamental problem. They could not see the targets. Iran had spent 2 decades burying its most critical assets deep underground. The Irk's aerospace force carved entire missile cities into the sides of mountains, such as the facility near Kermanshah, buried under roughly 500 meters of granite. These bases housed dozens of mobile transporter erector launchers, or TELs, each capable of firing ballistic missiles and then vanishing. Once a TEL drove out of its tunnel, it became a fleeting shadow. The vehicle moved constantly, often at night, using pre-planned hide sites along major highways and rural roads. American and Israeli satellites, for all their sophistication, operate on fixed orbital paths. A KH-11 spy satellite passes over a given point only once every day or two. In the gaps between passes, the launcher could reposition by dozens of kilometers. Thermal imaging and synthetic aperture radar could detect heat signatures or disturbed Earth, but a mobile launcher on a cold truck bed, under a commercial tarp, looked identical to any other 18-wheeler on Iran's sprawling road network. Persistent drone surveillance was equally limited. Iran's air defense network, while not impenetrable, made high-altitude, long-endurance drones vulnerable. The loss of a U.S. Global Hawk drone over the Strait of Hormuz was not just an operational incident. It exposed the raw arithmetic of attacking a nation of 1.6 million square kilometers. Iran is roughly the size of Alaska, or 3 times France. Its strategic targets do not cluster near a single border. They are scattered across vast deserts, mountain ranges, and deep underground facilities. The Natanz enrichment halls sit roughly 270 kilometers south of Tehran. The hardened Fordow plant is buried inside a mountain near Qom. To the east, the missile production hub of Kerman lies nearly 900 kilometers from the Western Front with Iraq. Naval command centers in Bandar Abbas on the Persian Gulf are a 5-hour drive from the nearest land border. A single strike package launched from an aircraft carrier in the Arabian Sea would need to cover distances of 500 to 800 kilometers one way. That forces every fighter to depend on aerial refueling tankers, which themselves are large, slow, and highly visible radar targets. Without access to bases in Iraq, Turkey, or the Gulf Arab states, the tempo of a sustained campaign collapses. The U.S. Air Force would need to generate sortie rates high enough to hit dozens of key military and nuclear sites simultaneously. Yet the sheer separation means aircraft spend most fuel just getting to the target and back. Earlier wargames by the Center for Strategic and International Studies estimated that a campaign against Iran's nuclear infrastructure alone would demand around 1,800 sorties in the first week, with many jets simply acting as escorts for the tankers. Every aim point may consume a significant share of resources. The geography itself breeds delay, stretches logistics, and gives air defense networks precious reaction time. The map, in the end, works like a silent weapons system. But the physical map was not the only terrain being contested in some cases. In parallel, a digital battlefield had already been seeded deep inside Iranian networks. The plan was textbook pre-strike doctrine, a covert cyber operation designed to blind the integrated air defense system, bricking radar arrays and scrambling command nodes just as the first wave of jets crossed the Iraqi border. In theory, it would peel back the electronic eyelids of the nation, leaving the sky unwatched for a critical 15-minute window. The code was delivered, likely through a compromised industrial controller or a tainted update file routed through a third-party contractor in the Gulf. It sat dormant, waiting for a wake-up call that was supposed to arrive roughly 3 hours before the first bombs fell. But something tripped it early. Forensic analysis later suggested a misconfigured timing protocol or a too aggressive network mapping tool inside the malware itself. Instead of a silent kill, the intrusion triggered a cascade of diagnostic alerts at a signals intelligence listening post outside Bandar Abbas. Iranian cyber defenders, hardened by years of Stuxnet and subsequent sabotage attempts, didn't just isolate the affected terminals. They interpreted the attack signature correctly, not as a standalone act of vandalism, but as the preparatory brush clearing for a kinetic wave. The supreme leadership was briefed within the hour. Immediate dispersal orders went out to mobile SAM batteries and hardened aircraft shelters. Missiles that were clustered at Imam Ali Base were suddenly on the move, hidden in the folds of the Zagros Mountains. The element of surprise is often considered a crucial factor in modern air warfare. The premature cybercard didn't just fail, it actively armed the defender with the one thing a geography like Iran already gives them in abundance: time to react. But time to react may not be the only concern. In the operations room, the real fear was what that reaction would look like. Planners understood that a strike on Iran, even a limited one, would not end in the skies over Natanz or Fordow. It would immediately shift to the missile batteries buried in the Zagros Mountains. Iran possesses the largest and most diverse ballistic missile arsenal in the Middle East, with roughly 3,000 projectiles capable of reaching U.S. bases in Qatar, the UAE, and Bahrain. The math was brutal. A single strike from a stealth bomber might knock out one nuclear facility. The response would be a salvo of dozens of Shahab-3 and Imad missiles, with conventional payloads raining down on the Fifth Fleet's headquarters in Manama or the sprawling Al Dhafra Air Base in Abu Dhabi. Civilian oil infrastructure, the lifeblood of the global economy, would be in the crosshairs. The Strait of Hormuz, through which a fifth of the world's oil passes, could be mined in a matter of hours by Iran's small boat swarms. The military calls this the escalation trap. It is a ladder where each rung is a weapon system with a larger radius, and the U.S. cannot guarantee it would climb faster than Iran. Commanders feared that the first American bomb, however precise, would authorize a counterstrike doctrine Tehran had rehearsed for decades. The Iranians had long ago concluded that their conventional forces could not match the United States, so they built a war machine designed for one purpose: to punish the neighborhood. The pause was not just about losing surprise. It was a dawning recognition that a conflict with Iran would not be a raid, but a flood, and no one had built an ark. That assumption was tested in a quiet corner of the Pentagon through a series of classified tabletop drills. In these simulations, a peer-level adversary launched a multi-axis saturation strike against a simulated regional airbase. The layered defense was formidable: a Patriot battery for high-altitude threats, a THAAD system for terminal phase intercepts, and a close-in Iron Dome battery to catch the leakers. On paper, it was a triple-layered steel dome. The war games delivered a brutal verdict. In the first wave, the attacking force fired salvos of roughly 60 to 80 munitions, a mix of cheap Grad-style rockets, cruise missiles, and drone swarms. The sophisticated interceptors engaged perfectly, but they were hunting expensive bullets with million-dollar darts. The Iron Dome launchers ran dry within minutes. The Patriot launchers exhausted their canisters trying to pick off the cruise missiles. A second, larger wave followed just 12 minutes later, targeting the gaps in the reload cycle. The defense simply could not breathe. The result was a logistical collapse of the kill chain. Munition stocks meant for a night of fighting were vaporized in a single hour. The runways were cratered, fuel bladders were burning, and the sortie generation rate for Allied fighters dropped to zero. The simulations proved that even a golden dome shatters when the sky is filled with iron rain. While war games in Tampa and Tel Aviv were busy proving the limits of kinetic force, a quieter channel was already lighting up. In Muscat, Omani intermediaries, the same trusted brokers who had carried messages for decades, received an urgent backchannel request. Iran's leadership had drawn a line. Through Omani intelligence, they communicated that any strike killing more than roughly 50 Iranian personnel would trigger an immediate non-linear response. That meant ballistic missiles aimed at Al Dhafra, at Al Udeid, at the desalination plants in Jebel Ali. The message was precise, it was calibrated, and it offered an off-ramp. The Omani Foreign Ministry relayed the terms to Washington within hours. Iran would absorb a limited symbolic hit on a Revolutionary Guard facility outside Isfahan, provided the attackers pulled back immediately afterward. No waves, no follow-on strikes. The Americans saw the political logic. A pause was no longer just a military necessity, it was a diplomatic escape hatch. Accepting the back-channel terms allowed both sides to claim victory. Tehran could spin the limited damage as a failed attack. Washington could argue it had restored deterrence without triggering a regional war. The third-party mechanism gave the White House deniability. No direct talks, no signed agreements, just a sequence of carefully worded messages passed through a neutral capital. The military pause became politically viable because the back-channel turned a potential quagmire into a choreographed, survivable exchange. The bombers turned back not just because the air defenses were thick, but because the off-ramp had been paved by quiet, patient Omani diplomacy. But the carrier's vanishing range was not just a diplomatic calculation, it was a hard mathematical consequence of Iran's anti-access area denial bubble. To understand why the air wing could not sustain a suppression campaign, we have to look at the geography. The Persian Gulf narrows to roughly 50 kilometers at the Strait of Hormuz. Inside that choke point, a carrier becomes a sitting target. Iran's layered coastal defenses, mobile C-802 anti-ship missiles, truck-mounted rod air defense systems, and swarms of fast-attack craft create a kill zone that extends well over 300 kilometers from the Iranian coast. For a Nimitz-class carrier, that means parking roughly 500 nautical miles offshore, deep in the Arabian Sea, just to stay outside the threat ring. At that distance, a fully loaded Super Hornet faces a round trip of over 1,000 nautical miles before it even enters Iranian airspace. That translates to roughly 6 hours of flight time, with multiple aerial refueling brackets required just to reach a target near Tehran. The math destroys sortie generation. A carrier that can launch 120 strike missions a day against a close-range adversary drops to fewer than 30 when operating from extreme standoff range. Pilot fatigue compounds the problem. After 2 such marathon missions, crews are physically exhausted. Tankers assigned to push a strike package forward are typically unavailable for combat air patrols over the fleet. The bubble does not need to sink the carrier. It just needs to push it so far back that the tempo of strikes becomes operationally irrelevant. A drizzle of bombs instead of a thunderstorm. The pause revealed that truth in stark terms. The loss of each airframe carries significant and lasting economic consequences. The United States Air Force currently fields well over 180 operational stealth fighters alone. The B-2 Spirit fleet counts only 20 airframes, each built at roughly $2 billion in today's money. The F-22 Raptor line closed years ago at 187 aircraft, with a replacement cost now hovering near $350 million per jet. The newer F-35, though more numerous, still runs roughly 80 to 100 million per airframe depending on the variant. You lose even a handful of these machines over Iranian soil, and the math turns ugly fast. The production lines cannot surge. Northrop Grumman shut down B-2 manufacturing in 1997. F-22 tooling sits in indefinite storage. The F-35's global supply chain moves at a fixed rhythm, currently churning out roughly 100 units a year for all customers combined, the U.S. share being a fraction of that. If a sustained campaign over Iran claimed just 12 to 15 stealth aircraft, a very plausible figure against dense, multi-layered air defenses, the replacement pipeline would stretch beyond a decade. You cannot will a new B-2 into existence. You cannot print an F-22. The loss could carve a lasting hole in the nation's most critical deterrent force. In many cases, that kind of damage is absorbed only when survival itself is at stake. For a non-existential threat, for a mission aimed at setting back a nuclear program rather than stopping an invasion, the ledger simply does not balance. The pause over Iran codified this brutal calculus. The price of rebuilding was time, and time was the one resource the mission did not have the political permission to lose. For decades, the doctrine of shock and awe promised that overwhelming air power could paralyze a state, break its will, and achieve political goals with startling speed. It was the cornerstone of modern American military dominance. The skies over Iran, however, wrote a different history. The pause in strike stands as a stark testament to its failure against a prepared, mid-sized nation. The calculus is simple but devastating. Shock and awe requires a concentrated, high-value target set to destroy a central nervous system. Iran, learning from decades of threats, deliberately eliminated that set. It dispersed its nuclear and military infrastructure across hundreds of sites, buried facilities under mountains, and integrated them within civilian areas. It built redundant systems and layered its air defenses not to win, but to deny easy victory. The result was not a target list, but a vast, resilient web. Against this, air superiority became a tactical fact but a strategic illusion. Many potential strikes demanded exquisite intelligence and carried high risk of limited damage or disproportionate civilian casualties. The promised paralyzing shock dissipated against a strategy of dispersion and denial. The pause, therefore, is not merely an operational halt. It is the silent admission that the core promise of shock and awe, rapid, decisive victory through air power alone, has met its match. A nation can, through preparation and sacrifice, neutralize a superpower's greatest advantage, turning a campaign of days into a grinding, unsustainable prospect. The doctrine was built for a different age and a different kind of war. So the pause is not an act of mercy or strategic patience. It is a confession. The operational tempo that shattered Iraq's Air Force in 1991 or crippled Libya's military in 2011 cannot be replicated against a country with roughly 1.6 million square kilometers of territory, much of it mountainous, and an air defense network built on decades of distributed, redundant, and hardened sites. Air power, for all its precision and speed, often runs into a brutal arithmetic problem in such scenarios. You can destroy the known radar, and a mobile backup powers on from a valley you have not mapped. You can crater a runway, and a team repairs it in hours because the Iranians have mastered rapid runway repair as a core competency since the 1980s. The limit is not in the technology of the bombs, but in the nature of the target. A sustained air campaign sufficient to truly degrade Iran's nuclear and military infrastructure would require a scale of sorties, a density of tanker support, and a tolerance for losses that no American or Israeli planner can honestly guarantee. The risk calculus flips. A campaign that fails to achieve its objectives while losing even a handful of advanced aircraft over hostile terrain becomes a strategic defeat more damaging than the original problem. The pause, therefore, reveals the honest limit. Military force, according to many analysts, cannot solve the Iran problem. It can only manage it, contain it, or delay it. The aircraft return to base not because the mission is complete, but because the mission, as a purely military endeavor, is impossible to complete without accepting a cascading risk of catastrophic failure that far outweighs any achievable objective.